So our next subcommittee is to focus on dietary patterns, and Carol Boucher, the chair of that subcommittee, will give the report. Carol.
Thank you. So I was introduced as Carol Boucher. I can confirm that I am, and I represent the Dietary Patterns Subcommittee. And they're good. There are the slides. And the other, you can see the other members of the subcommittee up on the slides also. Okay. Am I hitting the wrong button?
The arrow.
I think you're holding it upside down.
Oh,
There you go.
I was holding it upside down. It does not work that way. So for the next people, remember that. The topic areas that this subcommittee was tasked with are listed on this slide. The first 6 have asterisks indicating that those will be presented today. As noted, we're the Dietary Patterns Subcommittee, so the key definition that we are using for dietary patterns in all the 2020 Advisory Committee reviews are the quantities, proportions, variety, or combination of different foods, drinks, and nutrients where available in diets and the frequency with which they are habitually consumed. This definition was applied to all analytical frameworks for the subcommittee, which will be presented shortly, and for the ones that are not yet done. And this is an aspirational definition that was developed by a panel of international experts for the existing NESR systematic reviews. And all information provided by studies about the dietary patterns tested or examined, including both foods and beverages, macro and micronutrients, will be extracted from included articles. So the 2 questions listed on this slide, what is the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and all-cause mortality, and what is the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and sarcopenia, will be answered by conducting original NESR systematic reviews. So these have never been done before. The 4 questions listed on this slide with outcomes of neurocognitive health, growth, size, body composition, and risk of overweight and obesity, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes will be answered by updating existing NESR systematic reviews. The analytical framework that was brought up earlier is shown on this slide and illustrates the systematic review question examining the relationship between dietary patterns and all-cause mortality. So I'm going to start at the beginning of this slide. So you'll have heard this sentence before, but just to make sure that we're on the same page. This is the analytical framework shown on this slide. It illustrates the systematic review question examining the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and all-cause mortality. The analytical framework provides a foundation for the systematic review and helps to inform the development of the inclusion and the exclusion criteria. The subcommittee defines all-cause mortality as the total number of deaths from all causes during a specific time period. This is the first analytical framework presented. The others that you've seen today have been purely demonstration frameworks. So for this presentation, we will add animation to point out all the parts and pieces of the analytical framework. The intervention or exposure of interest is consumption and or adherence to a dietary pattern. The comparators are consumption of and/or adherence to a different dietary pattern and different levels of consumption and/or adherence to a dietary pattern. The outcome of interest in this particular case is all-cause total mortality. The population of interest for this particular case, intervention, exposure, and outcomes, the population of for interventions and outcomes are children through older adults who are healthy and are at risk for chronic disease. For the question, the subcommittee decided that infants and toddlers from birth to 24 months were out of the scope. Key confounders, which are factors that may impact the relationship of interest in this systematic review, are shown on this slide and include sex, age, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, physical activity, anthropometry, energy intake, and smoking. From this point forward, the analytical frameworks will look like this and not have animation. But they liked it so much, they did it twice. Okay, the next framework should be sarcopenia. It's coming. Yes, okay. The next topical area is sarcopenia. This is the systematic review framework examining dietary patterns consumed and sarcopenia. The subcommittee discussed and applied a definition of sarcopenia based on the review of the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health Biomarkers Consortium's Sarcopenia Project, as well as the consensus of 3 European working groups that converged to operationally define sarcopenia. The definitions those groups presented generally aligned on parameters of low skeletal muscle or lean mass, low strength or weakness, and/or low muscle performance. That is, mobility impairment, walking, speed, or function. Therefore, the definition for sarcopenia applied to this systematic review is progressive and generalized loss of skeletal muscle mass alone or in conjunction with either or both low muscle strength and low muscle performance. In this particular case, we have an intermediate outcomes which include low muscle mass, strength, and performance, and sarcopenia or severe sarcopenia as endpoint outcomes. The population of interest for the intervention exposure of dietary patterns includes adolescents, adults, and older adults who are healthy and are at risk for chronic disease. For this question, the subcommittee decided that infants and toddlers from birth to 24 months were out of scope. The population of interest for the outcomes of sarcopenia includes adults and older adults who are healthy and are at risk of chronic disease. The confounders are sex, age, socioeconomic status, anthropometry, total energy intake, dietary protein intake, physical activity, and physical disability. The next analytical framework is dietary patterns and neurocognitive health. The analytical framework here illustrates the question examining the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and neurocognitive health. The outcomes include developmental domains as specified on the right: academic performance, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, cognitive decline and cognitive impairment and dementia, Alzheimer's disease, anxiety, and depression. The population of interest includes children through older adults who are healthy and are at risk for chronic disease. For this question, the subcommittee excluded infants and toddlers because the birth to 24 months subcommittee will be completing this review. The key confounders: sex, age, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, anthropometry, total energy intake, alcohol intake, smoking, physical activity, and family history of neurocognitive disorders. The next analytical framework focuses on dietary patterns consumed and growth, size, body composition, and risk of overweight and obesity. The outcomes include weight and various forms of weight, body BMI, body composition and distribution, percent fat mass, fat-free mass, and incidence and prevalence of underweight, failure to thrive, stunting, wasting, healthy weight, overweight, and obesity. The population of interest for the intervention exposure and outcomes include children through older adults who are healthy and are at risk for chronic disease. For this question, again, the committee excludes infants and toddlers, and the birth to 24 months subcommittee will be handling this. Key confounders are sex, age, total energy intake, physical activity, anthropometry at baseline, and smoking. Cardiovascular disease is shown on this slide. The analytical framework here illustrates the review of dietary patterns consumed and cardiovascular disease. The intermediate outcomes include total cholesterol, low-density lipoprotein, high-density lipoprotein, triglycerides, and blood pressure. The endpoint outcomes include cardiovascular disease and specifications listed, stroke, venous thrombosis, cardiovascular disease-related mortality. The population of interest here includes children through older adults who are healthy and are at risk for chronic disease. The confounders, the key confounders, sex, age, energy intake, physical activity, anthropometry, and smoking. The type 2 diabetes is that's the last analytical framework that we finished before this meeting. And this illustrates the systematic review for type 2 diabetes and dietary patterns consumed. The intermediate outcomes include hemoglobin A1C, glucose, insulin, and prediabetes. The endpoint outcome is type 2 diabetes. The population of interest for the intervention exposure and outcomes includes children through older adults who are healthy and are at risk for chronic disease. Key confounders as shown is sex, age, total energy intake, physical activity, anthropometry, and smoking. The inclusion and exclusion here, these criteria were outlined in Dr. Schneeman's presentation. And so we will apply all of the ones that she outlined clearly in her presentation. And then inclusion and exclusion criteria unique to the various analyses that we are doing are starting here. And so for the 2020 Advisory Committee systematic reviews examining dietary patterns consumed, we'll apply all of the inclusion, exclusion criteria here for the intervention exposure to operationalize the definition of dietary patterns presented in this presentation. And studies that examine, so these will be studies that examine consumption and or adherence to dietary patterns such as an example, the dietary approaches to stop hypertension DASH, a vegetarian or vegan dietary pattern, a low carbohydrate dietary pattern, and high fat dietary pattern will be considered. They'll be measured or derived using a variety of approaches as specified in this inclusion criteria. Studies must describe the dietary pattern being tested or examined, at a minimum providing the foods and beverages consumed in the pattern for inclusion. Studies that examine low carbohydrate or high fat diets will be included as long as they meet the percent specified as, this is in the second row, as being the criteria which is less than 45% of energy from carbohydrate for low carb and or greater than 35% energy from fat which is high fat. And these are based on the AMDR. And the exclusion criteria are studies that did not provide a description of the dietary pattern, or that they label the dietary pattern, but they do not describe the foods and beverages, or the base pattern is solely on nutrients. So this is a very food-oriented group. And studies that do not provide a description of the macronutrient proportion examined, or do not examine the percentages specified for low carbohydrate or high fat, if that is the pattern that's being suggested. And then there are corresponding inclusions for the active comparators. So for some specifics for each of the outcomes that we're going to be looking at, for all-cause mortality, it's studies that are reporting all-cause mortality, and then we'll exclude studies that report only one mortality or two, because we're looking at mortality from all causes. And then the inclusions for sarcopenia were covered on the sarcopenia slide. We don't have any exclusion criteria for the neurocognitive health or for the gross size or body composition, overweight, and obesity, and these inclusions were shown in the analytical framework slides. There are exclusions for CVD, and that's will exclude hypertensive disorders during pregnancy and or lactation. And for type 2 diabetes, we'll exclude gestational diabetes during pregnancy and or lactation, and type 1 diabetes. The dates of publications that we'll be using are, the reason they vary so much, so we have actually 3 different date ranges, has to do is if it's a new, if it's a brand new systematic review or an update of NESR. So the date range of the publication for the new systematic reviews will be January 2000 to May 2019. The date range of publications to update existing systematic reviews for the neurocognitive health outcomes will be August 2014 to July 2019, and this is in addition to the included articles published from 1980 to 2014, and an additional search will be done to capture outcomes that were not considered in the existing review, because the neurological health outcomes have had many changes in the labels, and we want to catch all those changes in the labels that have occurred in current times. The date range of the publication to update the systematic reviews for growth and size and body composition in CVD and type 2 diabetes will be August 2013 to July 2019, and this is in addition to the included articles from the previous systematic review of 1980 to 2014. So our next steps as we move forward, we will develop next the protocols for the questions of what is the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and certain types of cancer. And then the next question will be, what is the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and bone health? Then, in addition, what we'll be doing as our next steps is implementing the protocols for all of the questions that were just presented. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. So many thanks to the DGAC subcommittee members for enthusiastically participating in weekly meetings, and appropriately the support people are displayed in the bottom box. And the reason I say that's appropriate is because they represent the foundation of this enterprise. They are tireless in supporting all the activities of putting together these efforts and really are contributing to the success of the process. So this slide represents the end and being open for questions.
Please.
Just Rick Mattis, one question. For the key confounders for the cardiovascular outcomes, did the committee consider sodium in there as something to contemplate? I know
We
it's a can
did.
of worms, but
No, we did talk about it. It's just it's so poorly measured. What are your thoughts? Do you think we should put it in?
I agree. Rarely is there an adequate measurement of it, but it does seem to be an issue that's very much on a lot of the population's mind, and we have an opportunity to evaluate the science and make a statement here. I don't know.
Yeah, so we have different, and the other thing, because it being hard to assess, it may not be present in the paper. So we could put it in the confounders that won't kill the paper. Would?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I'll make a note of that.
Yes, so that becomes a good measure of something where you want the data, you want to know if
Yeah.
sodium has been a part of the study.
Yeah,
and
good
report.
idea.
Other,
Tim Namey. Thanks for that nice presentation. So you listed, in terms of the patterns that we'd be considering, the DASH and vegetarian, vegan, low-carb, high-fat. Are there other patterns that are going to be included, or is that their list, or is that still up for
Those are
discussion?
EGs. Those are, it shouldn't be IE, they're EGs, they're examples. So really, the number of patterns available are very wide, and the most important conditions is that we can identify what the foods that comprise the pattern, and that, but it doesn't even have to have a name to make it in as a pattern. And we will take both theoretically derived patterns as well as hypothetically derived patterns. And I realized that was on the slide, but I didn't say it out loud.
Heather Leidy, two quick questions. One is a follow-up to that, and I know these are now examples, but I thought I'd just bring it back up. In terms of a low-carbohydrate diet, will there be ability to separate those out in terms of the other macronutrients, so there can be low-carb, high-fat, or low-carb, high-protein? So it sounds like all patterns are fair game, but I guess my point is, at the end of the day, will they be grouped according to certain dietary patterns that are listed, like low-carbohydrate diets, and that might actually be very different depending on the macronutrient content? Do you understand what I'm saying? So there's a pattern that's low-carbohydrate, but they're very different. There can be studies that define that, but then within that, they can have very different macronutrient compositions. And I just, maybe a point to consider that some things maybe shouldn't be grouped in terms of a generalized pattern.
You know, that's an interesting point, because we really are looking at dietary patterns and they would all be together, but that doesn't rule out that we might not look at them in, by different types. And I haven't, others here have been involved in this process before, and so I don't know when we start doing the analysis. Linda, I've been waiting for an opportunity to say that. You know this, so is that something that once we get to the analytical part that we can pull in parts and pieces and say, what happens if we take this one out? Or
Linda Van Hoorn. I'll let the other Linda speak for herself. But yes, I think this is definitely a topic that was discussed on some of our calls, including the sodium question, which of course is very much on the hot button list at the moment. But I think in some ways, this is reminiscent of the discussion we just had earlier about nutrients of concern.
Yeah.
I think we're in an interesting point now in the fact that everyone recognizes that eating patterns are more descriptive of someone's totality of intake. But I don't think there's any way you can separate an eating pattern discussion from nutrients of concern. And I think what we're experiencing, even as we're speaking, is the fact that in many ways, the discussion about eating patterns really has to incorporate the concept, at least, of nutrients, especially macronutrients, but even micronutrients. I was thinking as you were speaking about carbohydrates, one of the nutrients of concern in this country is low fiber intake. You know, the U.S. public eats less than half of the recommended amount of dietary fiber, which we all know is derived in complex carbohydrates. So my only point is here, I don't think we can eliminate from our consideration as we think about dietary patterns the nutrient, macronutrient, or other distinguishing characteristic that really differentiates across these different eating patterns.
And I appreciate that completely. Where I'm coming from actually is we're creating now, we're putting together the structure for these reviews, right, these systematic reviews. And in order to not be biased then, we really would have to make these decisions a priori. That's why I'm asking the question, is that, you know, right now we're lumping these all together, but what you're saying, and I am really open to it, is then we a priori would need to somehow desegregate some of these to capture what you were talking about, and because that may be of importance. Because if we put them all in and do it afterwards, that's not following the rules. So that's why I was asking in the past, has this been done of desegregating these exposures that these studies that you have found that they met your criteria, but now you're going to split them again?
This is Heather, again, as a follow-up. I'm just thinking in terms of the Nesser search terms. It's hard to keep it broad because if you're not having, you know, if, for example, in this case, our discussion has been about everything but protein. So as an example, if you don't search by high-protein diets and you just go low-carbohydrate diet, there's an opportunity to actually miss some of those within the Nesser search criteria, and which is something I didn't think about. I guess maybe the search terms will come later on down the road, or I mean, we're already really establishing that. So there's examples that are listed, but I'm just not sure if that actually translates into all-encompassing search terms that will be able to pick up all these different dietary patterns.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually an interesting one to check on.
I think it might be worthwhile if the staff could perhaps come. I know you're sitting over there, but I can't see you. So, particularly this question on the search terms, I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, this is Laurel English. So to the first point earlier, I did just want to touch on the fact that we will extract all data that are reported to speak to your concern about the other nutrients. So if it's a low carbohydrate diet and they report the nutrients, the other macros, micros, we will extract all information that is reported by the article, and then we can group accordingly to your earlier point in the evidence synthesis with Mediterranean diets, low carbohydrate, et cetera. So we can do that and plan to do that. For the next question on the search terms, we do develop a comprehensive search strategy, and we use, there are mesh terms in the PubMed database, for example, ketogenic diet, low carbohydrate diet, we also add in keywords. So we have developed a comprehensive search, and it is peer-reviewed by a second librarian. And then we also have test papers that confirm that our search is appropriate. So we believe it is comprehensive to that.
And also, we hope these
That's a
are
real-
intentional.
Another real quick question. This is on, I don't think you need to go there, but on slide 15, it's the type 2 diabetes. And for me, just more of a clarification, the endpoint outcome is type 2 diabetes. And I wrestled with this in the frequency of eating, and so I thought I'd bring it up. I'm wondering what the outcome is. So when you look at the cardiovascular disease, there's parentheses with qualifiers in terms of what that endpoint is. With type 2 diabetes, I understand what type 2 diabetes is, but it's generally identified as a certain HbA1c, and HbA1c is actually an intermediate outcome. So I'm just wondering what the type 2 diabetes endpoint outcome will be, except that if somebody has type 2 diabetes, but is that the only criteria, or is it really based on somebody's HbA1c and the changes of that? It's a moot point, but it's an intermediate right now, and it seems odd that why it isn't in the endpoint outcome. And I'm not a medical doctor, but generally people are diagnosed with their HbA1c levels, and so that's why I'm just trying to figure out why that's not an endpoint instead of an intermediate.
Well, that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Jamie?
I mean, I would think it's both, actually, and I think when they're searching for the health outcome type 2 diabetes, but when looking at studies, they'll include studies that have HbA1cs that are below the threshold for type 2 diabetes, so one can follow that over time to a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. I mean, I'd ask the staff, is that a correct interpretation? Yeah, I see heads bobbing. Yes.
Yeah, this is Laurel English again. And yeah, so to that point, it would be diagnosed type 2 diabetes. So if they were looking at dietary patterns consumed in those who were diagnosed with diabetes versus those who did not, that's really to get at that. But to your point, hemoglobin A1C, the other intermediate outcomes, we would be extracting in the data that are reported for those continuous measures or the particular levels. So it would be included pretty much as Dr. Kleiman mentioned.
So Dr. Ard? I think we had Dr. Ard and then Dr. Donovan.
So I was just going to, Jamie Ard, I was going to follow up on Heather's question and point and the answer that Laurel gave around the macronutrient distributions and the dietary patterns associated with that. I think it will be important for us to think about the categorization of those specific types of dietary patterns because, as we've said, there's a wide range of what people define as lower carbohydrate or lower fat. And sometimes I think it's probably just as important to understand what was reduced in the dietary intake as well as what replaced it. So in thinking about a lower carbohydrate intake, I want to also know, well, what replaced the carbohydrate? Was that replaced by fat intake or was that replaced by protein intake? And maybe even further, you could see a branching of, well, was that protein mostly vegetable protein or animal protein? Was that fat mostly saturated fat or unsaturated fat? So I think it will be important for us in describing the results to, as best we can, clarify what we mean when we say this is the particular macronutrient dietary pattern, so that we do avoid this sort of general lumping of, well, it's just this, as we wouldn't necessarily say, well, all vegetarian patterns are the same, because there are different forms of vegetarian patterns, and we would be specific to describe, well, this is vegan or this is lacto-ovo, et cetera. So I think that will be important for us to at least have a general working framework of how we might want to categorize that, and then put the studies in those relevant boxes to some extent. And it may not be at the level of, well, this has to be less than 20% carbohydrate, or this has to be less than 100 grams per day of carbohydrate, or to that extent, but at least some general framework of understanding not just what the reduced macronutrient was, but what replaced it.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've been,
I just wanted to piggyback on that just a bit. I think too, and we've discussed in our committee, the idea that the Mediterranean diet has many different variations. And so this probably will be true of all of the types of dietary patterns that we're looking at. Just wanted to add that.
yeah, no, that's absolutely right. But Jamie, I really appreciate what you said, because we've been really sensitive to the complexity of this. And I'm glad that this came up, so that really gives us additional guidance in moving forward. I think we'll be able to find all the papers, but it will be really somehow harmonizing them across the spectrum in some way that makes sense with regard to, I mean, really what's available now is far more than what we had previously, I do believe.
So Sharon Donovan, this is more of just a general comment, and because I noticed that your publication dates, one is May, one is June, one is July, and it seems to me as a committee, we should decide what is the latest date that we want all the systematic reviews to go to. We've talked about this because there's a bunch of new from the pregnancy B24 that were just published, but they only went to January of 2017. So while I understand we'll be rolling these, it seems like we should be consistent, or unless we can really justify why one should be May, one should be June, and one should be July.
Right, and actually, I have a feeling that when you're looking at the date, that's the furthest out date, the closest to now. The intent is to gather whatever is currently available, and perhaps the staff could comment on that. So May or June, I don't think there was an intent to make a difference there. It was probably when the protocol went into the box.
Yeah, this is Laurel again. Yeah, that's correct. And we wanted to get started as soon as possible after those two first the new questions were approved and those protocols were approved. We did also develop the search strategy and shared the search strategy, and then conducted the search so that the staff could get going on literature search and screening. So,
But we will be consistent in terms of, we're trying to gather the most current data.
yes, and if there was anything published after May, between May and July, for instance, we could do a secondary search to make sure that there were no additional publications that were missed between that time period.
So is that something we should adopt across the board then? Because I'm sure that's happening in every committee, subcommittee.
Oh, absolutely.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have one more report before we take a break at 11:45 for lunch. I'm sorry.
No, it's better to.
Rick Massey, and I'm thinking about this issue of the patterning and macronutrients and so on a little further, and just in case it helps your thinking as you go forward, you could couch it in different ways. You could talk about absolute level of each of those nutrients. You could talk about proportion of energy contributed by each of those nutrients. You could talk about the amount relative to recommendations of each of those nutrients. And I don't know what the right answer to that, but they could well give you different answers. And so you may want to think that through to make your decision.
Thank you.
So Dr. Sabate had a comment as well.
Joan Sabate, I have two comments to make. One is in line of what it was discussed before as far as what replaces carbohydrates or foods that are coming from mainly carbohydrates. And again, since this is mainly a committee that has to deal with foods, I think besides whether it's protein or fat that is replacing, I mean, I think we at least have to capture, I mean, if the foods that are high in protein and fats are coming from vegetables or from animal intake. Because, I mean, there are, from the food viewpoint, there are two ways, I mean, to accomplish a low carbohydrate diet. The second point relates to a slide that is number 13, that we discussed that because I'm a member of this committee, in which we relate the dietary patterns with anthropometrics, particularly overweight and obesity. And total energy intake is listed as a key confounder. I think listing as a key confounder may decrease the ability to connect, I mean, dietary patterns and overweight and obesity. I think before trying to use as a key confounder, we have to analyze as a mediator, because some of the dietary patterns may relate to the overweight and obesity, mediating through the total energy intake, especially when we do in descriptive epidemiology and how people, I mean, consume these dietary patterns. So I think that besides using as a key confounder, it has to be studied as a mediator between dietary patterns and anthropometrics, because it could be that the connection is mainly through total dietary intake.
Tim Namey, I wanted to, in terms of consistency, you were controlled for smoking as a confounder for all these, and you controlled for alcohol consumption for the neurocognitive health, but not for overweight and obesity and cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And so I thought you should probably be consistent one way or the other. But I think it's an important potential source of calories and other possible effects. So.
That's a good suggestion.
All right, and so eager for lunch. I jump to this last one. So we are now at the third presentation, and we will take a break for lunch at 11:45, so we have plenty of time. And Dr. Heather Leidy is going to present for the Frequency of Eating Subcommittee.